Hello, this is Atheists Talk, a program presented by Minnesota Atheists. My name is Jack Caravela. I'll be your host. With me is Dr. Grant Steeves, Doctor of Theology. In a previous program, we talked about why non-believers specifically should study religion and how it's affected our culture. In this program, we're going to talk about how science can evaluate religion and what tools of science we can use to study religion. And thank you for joining us first.
Thank you.
And the first question is really, what do we need to use to apply the scientific approach to religion? How can we do it?
I'm not a scientist, so that's not my expertise, but I do know something about science, and especially as it can be applied to religion. And I know that one of the first things you have to do is try to define words that you're going to be using.
Correct.
So that you have some clarity as to what is going to be studied. So when we start to look at the word religion as a concept, it is an area where we have problems. One, people don't agree on what should be included. Should we talk about a personal deity, or should we talk about some supernatural energy entity? They're not the same. I might point out, for example, that Albert Einstein was closer to the latter part, that energy and sort of the mystery of the universe was God to him, if it was a God. And people who are fundamentalists like to look at that and say, oh, he believed in God. No, you're thinking of a personal God. That's not exactly what Einstein was talking about. So we have those kind of differences of opinion. You have people who equate religion with Christianity. This was particularly true in the 19th century and early 20th century, but it still pops up in writings because they want to show that Christianity is superior to these other religions. We're monotheistic, and you still are polytheistic. That's an inferior form of religion. So we have that kind of imposition. Some definitions are overly broad. They're trying to cover too much, or they can be too narrow. That's obvious in almost any kind of definition. And then there's that problem of the circular definition that people get into, where you look up a word and you find that it refers to another word that refers back to that word, and before you know it, the ball is a ball is a ball is a ball. You're not really defining what is the ball or what is religion. And you can't get into that kind of a trap. So if I define religion as spirituality, and you ask me, well, what is spirituality? And I say, well, it's religion. I've really clarified it for you, haven't I?
Doesn't get us anywhere.
No, it doesn't. So,
I'm sorry, we might have a bit more luck to begin with in defining science, because one common misconception, especially among believers, is, well, isn't science just another religion that requires blind faith?
Yes. Science is not blind faith. Science is not a noun, in a sense. Science is a method. It's a way of approaching ideas. Now, not every scientist uses what we traditionally call the scientific method. But essentially what they're doing is observing, they're doing experiments, they're looking for verifiability, and they're looking for falsifiability. None of those things are going to be found in religion when we look at it. So science is attempting to find things that can be put into the area of proven facts, not revelation. So there's a sharp contrast between the two systems of thought and approaching a subject. When we start putting science to religion, then, what we're asking for is verification, possibility of falsifiability of an idea, and can we do this through observation, can we do this through experimentation, and apply it to it. And that's where it becomes difficult, because again, people are not going to agree. The definitions, I think, you can arrive at a definition. Science, certainly, we can arrive at a definition that doesn't seem to have a lot of ambiguity in it. Religion tends to, most definitions. You don't have contradictions as such, and you try to avoid those. And we try to find what is going to be included and excluded, and agree upon those things. Those are the things that need to be involved with that. There's also the problem of whether or not you put in the area of the sacred and spirituality, because those two words are sometimes used interchangeably with religion. And again, they are separate from. So I personally look at spirituality as kind of an aesthetic experience. The sacred can be anything that is held with regard, perhaps with awe, but is set aside from it. It's almost taboo. So we have sacred words, as I refer to them. The F word, faith. There's another F word as well. But people will use words in that kind of sacred sense, or the N word, sacred words. The reality is, as soon as I use the F word, I really am using the word faith. I may as well use it, see?
Well, it's true, and you've gotten to the kind of the crux of the problem sometimes in defining religion to begin with. In the previous program we did, it seemed that you were hinting or saying that religion was really an ideology, and it didn't necessarily have to be even supernatural, when you mentioned that the credos of Stalin and Hitler could be viewed in the same way as religion, as a religion. Something to be regarded without question, perhaps? Was that a fair comment?
I'm going to go topsy-turvy here in terms of, I'm going to give my definition first, and then we're going to go back and look at some of the aspects of it. But I have a definition which is perhaps a little on the controversial side, but I've never shied away from that. And that is, I see religion as an irrational belief, acceptance, dedication, or faith in an authority. It doesn't have to be supernatural, but it could be. And that results in an ideology and a closed thought system.
I see.
And I think this is also something that can be proven scientifically. I think that you can apply the rules of verifiability and falsifiability to this and come through with some evidence, empirical evidence.
Right, to use science to actually come to that definition.
And in order to do that, and in terms of the definition that I did decide on, I'm trying to make it relevant in terms of all kinds of people. That a person who's Hindu can look at this and say, I can accept that as a kind of definition, or a Muslim could. I think that you try to find a definition that covers different aspects of life. I think the definition I just gave attempts to do that. It relates to the social and the public practice of it, and at the same time it also relates to the private experience that people have in their lives. So I think those are sort of ground rules leading up to a definition.
Now, science is concerned with empiricism.
Yes.
As you said, falsifiability. Is it possible to use empirical research methods to study religion or religions?
I think it is, in the sense that you identify particular beliefs or actions or rituals within a religion and ask questions that can be tested. The Templeton Foundation, which happens to be funded by a religious organization, wanted to do a study about prayer. Prayer is a kind of a characteristic of almost all religions. It may vary in terms of its manifestation, but there's prayer in almost every religion, attempting to address the supernatural being. So they were looking at it from Christianity's point of view. The medical clinics, Mayo Clinic was one of the clinics that were involved in this study. They had several hundred people. It wasn't a very small group. And I believe it was only with heart patients, as I recall. And they did a blind study so that the doctors that were involved did not know the patients that were prayed for and those that were not prayed for. The patients, some of them knew they were being prayed for, some of them did not know they were being prayed for. So they had as many different variables covered as possible. And what did they find out in this empirical study? They found that patients that knew they were being prayed for were more apt to die than people that didn't know.
Mm-hmm.
The result was prayer isn't that effective, that it really doesn't work. The only time that they found that it has some chance to work is if I pray for myself. And this has to do with confidence and relationship with my presumed great dragon in the sky or whatever, and it may help me, comfort me, and that's what religion does for individuals. But if a whole congregation sits down and prays for Brother Seymour, it may not help him at all, because in fact if they inform him of that, it may be like the priest showing up to give the last rites. I'm dead. It's just a matter of time now.
Right.
And they feel that's what happened with people that were told that they were being prayed for. That some of them responded positively, but some of them responded negatively.
Maybe a bit more pressure.
And more pressure to, yes,
Right.
more pressure.
But in the final analysis, it seemed there was no benefit to
No
prayer,
benefit.
whether they knew or did not know that they were
Right.
being prayed for.
It was a no. It was not going to be effective. That is one aspect or one characteristic of religion that should be looked at in terms of study, and has been. I think that you can address the issue of a characteristic of religion, which is that there's supernatural or sacred. Now we can't directly go at that from an empirical standpoint, where we test the existence of God. I think Victor Stenger's probably comes the closest to a person who says, I can prove it. I believe he had passed away, so
Not too long ago, a few
yeah,
months
not
ago.
too long ago. But he was really pretty confident in his position. A lot of other people are not that confident, but it is not something you necessarily can directly address. You address the area of communication. And as I said in the previous, where you have proof that the earth is no longer flat but round, well it never was flat, but that it is round, or that we're not the center of the universe, this undermines the credibility of the idea of the supernatural. Because if it's the supernatural that gave us this information, now we have a question. Or take prayer that is going to heal. Now we come back to a question of faith. And you say, well, faith is involved in healing people. And you say, well, this person couldn't be healed because he didn't have enough faith. I don't think there is a record of anyone that has had their leg regenerated, an amputee.
True.
There are a lot of diseases which can be placebo in effect and cures. I'll take myself as an example. I went in, was tested, found to have cancer. 6 months later, they didn't find cancer. It's because I prayed, Jack.
I doubt that very much.
I didn't pray. It just disappeared. Did people pray for me? Not that I know of, because I didn't really tell that many people that I had the problem.
Right.
And I don't think they were praying for me.
Right.
So, was it a miracle? No, this is what happens in humans' bodies. Human bodies do fight off diseases. It has a natural occurrence. Science has saved more lives in the last century than any God has in the previous millennium. Millions of years. Just hasn't happened.
And killed far fewer.
Killed far fewer. I mean, yes, science has invented things which kill people.
True.
But people are the ones who are doing the killing. They're using dynamite, let's say. It wasn't originally designed to be a weapon, but it can be used as a weapon.
Right.
Vaccines have been created to cure ills that God hasn't been able to do before, strangely enough.
Right. And
He didn't prevent the plague from hitting Europe.
right. Actually, I think in one of Susan Jacoby's books, she points out that the rise of non-belief often is accompanied by scientific advance.
Yes.
For instance, when the polio vaccine was introduced,
Right.
that prayer was not effective, the vaccine was.
That's right.
Brings us to another important word, evidence.
Yes.
And evidence, when it comes to science, is a very specific definition. When it comes to religion, it's a bit different. Perhaps you could go into that. What either side sees or accepts as evidence?
In science, we've briefly touched on it. It's empirical evidence, which is verified. It's through experimentation. It's through statistical studies. It's through blind studies. It is an attempt to cover as many variables as possible to try to prove something or disprove something. In religion, it's more often revelation, or it's personal. People that suddenly are born again, they have this feeling, the great release. What is the evidence? It's not there, but we know that people have the same feeling when they are released from, let's say, the fear of cancer. And you walk around for a few days, months, as I did, with the idea that I have cancer, and you think, oh, this could be serious. It's a burden. And then you find out, and the day that I found out, I walked out of that doctor's office feeling pretty good. I don't know if I was born again, but I felt pretty good.
Right.
Even the day that I received my scholarship to go to college as a high school student, I remember walking out to that mailbox and getting that scholarship, realizing that without that, I wouldn't have been able to go to college. I was pretty happy that day. I was born again in a university in that sense.
Right.
So we have these experiences that are personal, and they happen in all parts of our lives, and it has nothing to do with God. It has to do with our own happiness and a feeling of emotional happiness. The other part of it is revelation. A more recent example of it can be put to the Mormon Church. Up until, I think it was maybe in the early 70s, I'm not sure of the date, people of a dark colored skin, African Americans or people of dark colored skin, yes, were not permitted to be members of the church, of the priesthood, as they referred to it. And then the head of the church suddenly had a revelation, and it was okay. We welcome our brothers of color. Interesting. It wasn't science that came to this conclusion, it was a revelation. I refer to it as civil rights finally caught up with them. And they realized that they weren't in the 19th century looking at golden tablets that came from nowhere, we've never found, nor will we ever see. But that's how it happened.
And the word revelation, the concept, is a way to deny that a more secular explanation is really behind the change.
Yes, yeah. And as long as, because who's going to challenge the head of the church? Pope, Francis, whatever his name is going to be. He makes these pronouncements, and that's the way it's going to be, because he's infallible on certain teachings in the church. There is no evidence. There's just this revelation. Within the church, the closest thing that you could get to it is perhaps when they fail, and they have to give in to science or reality. And I reference back to groups that have predicted the end of the world, like Jehovah's Witnesses, and then having to change their mind. They're facing facts in a very interesting way. And then it's suddenly revealed to them, oh, that wasn't the truth.
Well, in some instances when I've been at a Minnesota Atheists event that's open to the public, we're at many fairs and occasions where believers will come up and ask questions. And when someone has a personal revelation, they say, I saw Jesus, so I know. At first I wondered how to respond to that. And eventually came to the conclusion that I can get contradictory revelations from people of different faiths who saw Muhammad, who saw a different deity, and they're just as certain. However, ultimately it seems to be futile, because that one person is sure that their version is correct because they experienced it. Do you find that same type of difficulty or frustration in trying to not necessarily counteract, but question personal revelation?
Yes, because personal revelation is just that. It is personal. There is no way of contradicting it other than to say, I've had similar experiences. And I didn't attribute it to God, I attribute it to my own imagination. People that are deeply religious are subject to wanting to believe something. This is the concept of faith again. And I remember as a child, we had a neighbor whose mother claimed that Jesus Christ carried her groceries out for her one day to the car. I thought that was quite interesting at the time, and still do. And you couldn't explain it away by saying it was some guy at the grocery store that carried them out for her that maybe had a beard or something.
Long hair.
And long hair.
Wearing sandals.
Because she was so convinced that that was the case.
Right.
Yeah, this is a story that I haven't really told that often about myself. When I was going through a conversion process to Catholicism, and I had a great emotional time of it going through this experience. Living in the apartment at the time was this person who was mentally challenged. And he would come up every day and go to work. And this one day that he was going to go to work, there had been a really bad snowstorm. I was not able to go to school. Schools were closed. Buses were not going. And I told him you couldn't go to work that day because the buses were not moving. City buses were not moving. And he said, I have to go to work. He walked away from me, and then he turned around and looked at me, and I saw the face of Jesus Christ. Now, remember that in the tradition of the church, this is not uncommon to see in a person the face of Jesus. What happened to me? Was I hallucinating? Was it a miracle? None of the above. At the time, I thought it was very strange or peculiar, an unusual experience, but I knew that it was a trick of the mind. It's what I wanted to see, in a sense. And it was on my mind because I had been thinking about it. The same thing happens with people that have déjà vu. I've been there before. And I recall having déjà vu experiences and then going back and explaining them in a rational way. And if we go back and look at all these incidents and we take away the faith aspect or the hallucinatory aspect and ask ourselves what really took place, and do we know something neurologically about a person today that we didn't in those days? Can we explain it scientifically or empirically? And I think in almost every case we can do that very thing. That's why, although the church, we had a conversation about the fact that Pope Francis has approved of exorcists.
Yes,
But-
he's doubled the number at the Vatican.
You have to qualify this. And that is, the exorcists are experienced in psychology and not just in hocus pocus. Now, it's true, it's church psychology. I know you're skeptical here. But they're less apt to look at it as a demon than they used to. Their approach now is very, very different. They use prayer and things like this because they know there's a placebo effect. But the church itself is not as deeply steeped in that old exorcism belief system. Only the people are. And it's hard to turn that, it is, after all, a huge, huge ship. It outweighs the Titanic, and the iceberg is reality and knowledge, and they have to try to avoid it. And it's moving around.
I might differ a bit on the exorcism question because one of the worst things you can tell a person, for instance, who has schizophrenia, is that the voices you're hearing are demons.
Right.
And to actually give them actually increase their delusion and make their situation more problematic.
The church has tried to avoid that enormously, though, in the 20th or late 20th and the 21st century. There are religions which do not do that.
Right.
They do not make that kind of a distinction. I had that experience with the witnesses, Jehovah's Witnesses. There was a member of their congregation that was schizophrenic. She had gone off her medication and she was quite delusional. They thought she was possessed by a demon. They disfellowshipped her or excommunicated in terms of Catholicism, removed her from the congregation. She showed up at my door and she wondered what to do. And in my very best witness voice, I said, weren't you a Catholic at one time? I said, a priest would be more welcoming to you and might help you more than they will, because they really didn't understand schizophrenia and mental illness.
Yeah, there's something that's
tragic.
going on right now on the internet, a fad to summon a demon by
Yes.
putting two pencils, the
Sure.
Charlie phenomenon. And what makes it even more, I don't know, amusing or sad is that priests and clergy have said, rather than debunking this, don't do this because it is possible to actually summon a demon.
Right, right.
And it just makes things worse and increases ignorance. But
Hallucinations and the figment of the imagination is really powerful in people. It's beyond belief how easily we fall into it as a trap. Ouija boards. And that's why we have people like the amazing Randy who can debunk it.
Right. And in closing, one of the complaints you hear from people who are religious is that the problem with science is that it's always changing. It's
Yes.
nothing you can be certain of.
Right, right.
And what do you think of that, and how do you respond to that complaint?
Remember the Shroud of Turin?
Very well.
With certainty. It was placed on the body of Jesus Christ. And then the Pope, John Paul, actually gave permission for scientists to take a small piece of it and examine it. And it was something like the 15th century, and it did not
Conform
go
in any
along
way.
or conform with anything that would be happening in Jerusalem in that period of time. They exposed it. That's what happens when we apply science to these myths. And that's what we have to do more of. And when people are encouraged to do Ouija boards and other things, we have to try to expose them to what is science and show them how it can be used.
But I suppose the problem is a need for certainty. And in
It is.
the minute we have left, how do we deal with the need for certainty in believers and convince them that it's better to have continual error correction to never get at the ultimate truth, but to get closer and closer with the scientific method?
I think perhaps medicine is maybe one of the areas that helps them to understand that. A lot of people approach doctors as certainty, and doctors will tell you they're not certain. They'll give you a percentage, in fact, and which is doubt. And you don't like living with that kind of a doubt. People want and desire certainty in all aspects of their life. But the reality says that when I step out onto the curb out here to cross the street, I may get run over. That's not certainty, that's doubt.
Right.
And it's doubt that keeps me from staying in here and going out there. It's not certainty.
That's a good example, and I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you for joining us. You've been with Dr. Grant Steeves and Jack Caravela. I've been your host. I've enjoyed the conversation very much. Thank you for being with us. Want to mention that Minnesota Atheists has a website you can visit, MNAtheists or MinnesotaAtheists.org. You can sign up to receive our newsletter, find many different events that we have, and I hope you will do that because we're interested in growing a very strong community of non-believers. Thanks very much for joining us.